What does the space shuttle have to do with empathy? Come with me on this journey. So let's start by imagining this. A quiet morning on the Florida coast. The chatter of mission control leads to a countdown, a momentary pause, and the explosive blast of the greatest rockets propel you upward into the atmosphere. Eventually, the rocket engines and the fuel tank break away, leaving a solitary spaceship orbiting above the Earth. Our blue planet and the indigo arc of the atmosphere serve as the ideal backdrop for the most amazing vehicle ever invented. This is Space Shuttle Atlantis, a $100 million museum at Kennedy Space Center. Atlantis opened on July 29th, 2013, and I was there on that special day because this was my project. We designed this museum in all of its aspects. It was an extraordinary honor to tell Atlantis' story over 126 million miles of space missions. We wanted to tell the story of a machine that was an epic story, a machine that changed man's perspective and our understanding of our planet. We decided to show Atlantis in space, in orbit, doing its thing. So we elevated it 40 feet above the floor and tilted it at a 43.21 degree angle as if it had just pulled away from the International Space Station. No one thought that we could show this zero-gravity vehicle this way on Earth, and it took some doing. Since it opened, almost 3 million people have come to see Atlantis and to be inspired by the story of NASA's space shuttles. This journey of Atlantis, in many ways, matches my own life's journey and the story of America's space program. The story of Atlantis and the space shuttle is one of a journey that was repeated over and over again. And in many ways, it's like life. You are always shaped by your past and the adjustments that you make along the way. For me, some things have come back in interesting ways, and these have played out in two conflicting views of my own mission, my own life's journey. So I was there at Kennedy Space Center in the 1960s. I took the tour with my family in the time of Apollo. I remember how proud we were to be Americans, to live in a country capable of doing something like putting a man on the moon, to create such heroes. I was a child of the Apollo era, as many as you were, and I remember on our home television this scratchy black and white footage as an astronaut came down the ladder and set foot on the moon. It was and remains a highlight of my life. My souvenir from our trip to Kennedy Space Center were the mission patches from the Apollo missions, each one designed by the astronaut crew themselves. My mother, who thought it would be suitable decor for a boy's bedroom that I shared with my brother Brian, took those mission patches and with Elmer's glue arranged them carefully in a drugstore frame. I loved looking at those colorful mission patches and thinking about their design. Each one represented deep symbolism, Greek mythology, and American icons. But one of these, however, was unique. It was the Apollo 11 patch. It was the simplest, the most powerful, and most importantly, it didn't carry the names of the crew members. It was a patch of the first crew that landed on the moon and their commander, Neil Armstrong. Now, Neil Armstrong was an exceptional guy. He was from Southern Ohio, where I went to school. He was fearless, precise, and entirely focused on the job he had to do. And he knew the most important thing of all. The job he had to do was bigger than he was, It was bigger than his crew, bigger than NASA. It was for all of humanity. This is why the Apollo mission patch doesn't bear the names of the crew, because it was an extraordinary accomplishment for all of humanity. Neil Armstrong's example is a life lesson in getting the big picture and understanding your place in it. And for that reason, he was and is my hero. But I never wanted to be an astronaut. I didn't have the right stuff. Growing up, I wanted to be an architect. So as my interest in architecture grew, I looked around my Illinois hometown for good examples. Turns out there weren't very many good examples of architecture in my hometown. But eventually, I came across the early masterworks in Illinois of Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, the more you learn about Wright, you know that he was an exceptional ego. Wright practiced architecture to fulfill his creative vision. His clients were simply the vehicle that allowed him to achieve this vision. Now, to be sure, Wright created some of the greatest works of American architecture. But unlike Neil Armstrong, you clearly get the sense that Wright didn't think that his job was bigger than he was. It was all about him, and he was plenty big enough. So, going to architecture school and learning to be an architect, I decided that I too should be Frank Lloyd Wright, that I should be a great designer and make my mark on the world of high design. Young architects are trained to be confident in their ideas and to defend them in the face of withering criticism. It can be tough, but you develop a pretty strong sense of your capabilities as a designer. And in fact, if you combine this with ambition, you can have some pretty lofty, self-serving aspirations. I entered professional practice with this point of view. In fact, convinced that there were no firms here in St. Louis sufficient to sustain my aspirations, I told my wife Ann upon graduating from WashU that as soon as possible we would blow this joint. We would leave town and go for one of the great design centers, New York, Boston, Los Angeles. But without even bus fare for these places, in 1986 I settled for a local firm until we got on our feet. And that firm was PGAV. And it was at PGAV that Frank Lloyd Wright collided with reality. And I almost didn't survive this collision, but I did, thanks to my friend Neil Armstrong. So now I should confess to you that 29 years later, I am still at PGAV. And I have the fortune of being its chairman and CEO. I really have a wonderful job thanks to 120 people who also work there, many of whom are here today. And that would sound all too good to be true if it weren't for the fact that for my first 3 years at PGAV, I almost quit every other week. It was a time of great self-questioning and doubt. It was stressful to the point of making me physically sick. You see, my Frank Lloyd Wright aspirations were in conflict with the realities of architectural practice. Perhaps I wasn't as talented as I aspired to be. But more importantly, I was doing it for the wrong reasons. It took me many years. But more importantly, it required that I take into account the needs of the people who actually used our work, the millions of visitors each year to our attractions. I started to watch them very closely and see how they interacted with our designs. There were many surprises, and many of them were humbling. I developed a voracious appetite for information about them. We started to commission national research projects on their needs, their wants, and their behaviors. You know, and as with all good research, the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. Designing destinations is all about empathy, a deep understanding of the visitor. I look at it this way. They give us their precious leisure time, and we must make it wonderful, memorable, and meaningful. This is our mission. And in the course of this transformation, I learned something important about myself. I was only happy when I realized that I had a mission far bigger than me. I was only happy when I gave myself over to this mission. This way of thinking brought me back to something that had touched me in childhood. When I started the project at Kennedy Space Center, my mother found those framed Apollo mission patches in her basement. They're now proudly displayed in my home. And at an Apollo reunion event at Kennedy Space Center a couple years ago, I got to introduce my son Ben to the man who introduced me to the concept of mission, my friend Neil Armstrong. So today at PGAV, we have very many talented young designers. And you see them here. These are your neighbors, St. Louis. They are invariably more talented than me and have great promise for the future. And sometimes I see them struggle as they try to find meaning and fulfillment in their work just as I did. We encourage them to think of design as an out-of-ego experience. The end result should not be about self-satisfaction at all, but rather the goals of our clients and the experience of our visitors. But sometimes it can take them years before they realize that their job is in fact bigger than they are too. We ask them to work on projects all over the world and to consider the needs of visitors from many cultures. This has taken them to Scotch tastings in Scotland and whale watching in the San Juan Islands and singing karaoke in China. It's quite an adventure. We ask them to become passionate on topics like space exploration, Egyptian archaeology, and beer tasting. You have to have a pretty big appetite for learning and a very broad palate. We ask them to carefully watch and even interact with the visitors at our destination, sometimes capturing those special moments when visitors profoundly connect with their loved ones. Our people have been moved to tears by watching families rediscover one another. We ask them to draw from their own life experiences. Truly deep empathy only comes when you understand yourself. Our work can fundamentally transform the visitor, change the way they see themselves, their friends, or their place in the world. This is a gift that we cherish every day. I love this following definition of design. It is the ideal blend of creativity and empathy. You can call us Empathy Incorporated. We are a company dedicated to placing our designs in the service of destinations. And this next generation of destination designers at Kennedy Space Center created the ideal launching pad for the next generation of space explorers. Mission accomplished. I wonder what Neil, I think Neil would approve. Thank you.